You always had everything, Elena. Your talent, your success, your husband, your perfect life. But tonight, I am finally taking what should have been mine. Finally, she is out of our way.
The wind coming from the cliffs was violent that night, tearing through Elena Whitmore's torn evening dress as she desperately held onto the edge of a 100-foot drop after Victoria pushed her off the cliff. Her strength was fading, and beneath her was an ocean that waited patiently for the moment she could no longer hold on. But the fall was not what terrified Elena. It was the person standing above her, the woman she once called her closest friend, the woman who had held her newborn son, celebrated her wedding, and promised they would always be family. Now, that same woman looked down at her without regret. "You always had everything," she whispered. "Your talent, your husband, your perfect life." Elena looked past her and saw the man standing silently behind her, her husband, the man who once promised to love her forever, the man who was now watching her die. "Adrian, why?" Elena cried. But he said nothing, because this was never an accident. It was a plan. The woman above her slowly pressed her heel against Elena's fingers. Elena screamed, her grip broke, and she fell into the darkness below. That night, two people celebrated the death of Dr. Elena Whitmore, believing they had erased her forever. But they made one mistake. They forgot that some people are not destroyed by what breaks them. They are transformed by it. Before we continue Elena's journey, please subscribe, like this video, and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories to life. Now let's continue and uncover the betrayal that changed Elena forever. 2 years before that night on the cliff, Elena Whitmore had a life most people only rehearse in daydreams. She was, at just 34, one of the youngest neonatal surgeons ever profiled in international medical journals, not for ambition alone, but for a single, extraordinary procedure she had spent nearly a decade refining. It allowed surgeons to operate on premature infants whose organs were barely the size of a thumb, children who, only a generation earlier, would have had no chance at all. Parents who had been told to say goodbye instead brought their babies home. Elena's hands had become, quietly and without her ever seeking the spotlight, some of the most trusted hands in the world. She had not built this life alone, and she never once pretended she had. Her father, Dr. Harold Whitmore, had spent 40 years constructing the Whitmore Children's Medical Center, brick by brick, favor by favor, sleepless night by sleepless night, until it became one of the most respected pediatric institutions on the Eastern Coast. Elena had grown up in its corridors. She knew the sound its elevators made before she knew her multiplication tables. When her father passed the legacy to her, it did not feel like an inheritance. It felt like a covenant. At home, she had built something even more fragile and more precious. A marriage to Adrian Cross and a newborn son named Oliver, whose faint cries could undo the worst day of surgery in under a minute. Adrian had not always been the polished, celebrated physician the world now knew. When Elena first met him, he was a second-year medical student with more debt than direction, brilliant in flashes but disorganized, hungry but unsure where to aim that hunger. Elena had seen something in him nobody else had bothered to look for. She shared her research access with him when he had none of his own. She stayed up with him through nights of failed practice exams, quizzing him until sunrise, believing in him with a stubbornness that eventually became self-fulfilling. When her father passed the hospital's leadership to her, Elena had brought Adrian in alongside her, giving him a seat at the head of the institution she had grown up inside. Co-director in title, her equal in every meeting, her partner in every decision that shaped the hospital's future. She had done it without a second thought, because that is what love does when it has not yet been taught to keep score. He had never forgotten it, or at least, he said he never would. "If I ever become successful," he told her once, early in their marriage, "it will be because you believed in me before anyone else did." Elena held on to that sentence for years. She would return to it in her mind during the hard seasons of marriage, the missed dinners, the arguments about money, the ordinary friction of two demanding careers under one roof. And it would steady her, the way an anchor steadies a boat. It cannot see the bottom beneath. Their marriage was not without its cracks. What marriage, built by two ambitious people working impossible hours, ever is? But underneath the cracks, there was warmth. And underneath the warmth, there was history. And for a long time, that felt like more than enough. Then Victoria Ashford came back into their lives, and the cracks stopped being cracks. They became fault lines. Victoria had known Elena since childhood, the kind of friendship built on shared birthday parties and family vacations, the kind that leaves you assuming, wrongly, that time has not changed the person underneath. She was the only daughter of Richard Ashford, a billionaire whose name opened doors before he even finished knocking on them. Victoria had grown up in a world where inconvenience simply did not exist. Problems were not solved. They were paid to disappear. She had beauty that turned heads in every room she entered, and a restless charm that made people want to be near her, even when some instinct told them not to trust her. What she did not have, what no fortune on earth could purchase for her, was the quiet, ordinary miracle that Elena possessed without even seeming to notice it. A husband who had once loved her enough to change for her. A career built from nothing but grit and belief. A small boy who reached for her the moment she walked into a room. Victoria told herself, for a long time, that she simply admired Elena's life. It took longer than it should have for her to admit, even privately, that admiration had curdled into something closer to hunger. She entered their lives slowly, the way water finds a crack in a foundation, not with force, but with patience. She began showing up to help with Oliver on the nights Elena was in surgery until dawn. She praised Elena constantly, effusively in front of others, the kind of praise that made Elena feel guilty for ever doubting her. She inserted herself into hospital matters that were never hers to touch, sitting in on board meetings as Adrian's guest, offering her father's capital for a new wing of the building, making introductions to donors and regulators that only someone with the Ashford name could provide. Until board members had grown just as used to seeing her in the room as they were to seeing Adrian. To everyone watching from the outside, Victoria looked like the most devoted friend a struggling young family could ask for. Behind closed doors, in quiet moments when it was only her and Adrian, she planted something else entirely. And it was in these same private hours, long before any plan against Elena existed, that the first line between Victoria and Adrian quietly blurred. Neither of them would speak of it aloud for years, but it would not stay buried forever. "You sacrificed your whole life for her dreams," Victoria would murmur, refilling his glass, letting the words settle before continuing. "You gave up years so she could become who she is. And what do you have to show for it? A last name, a shadow to stand in." She was patient. She never pushed too hard, too fast. She let the seeds she planted sit in silence for days before returning to water them. "She controls everything, Adrian. The hospital, the legacy, even your name, in a way. Everyone still calls you Elena's husband, don't they? Not the other way around," She will never let you become the man you actually are. Not because she means to stop you, because she doesn't even see that she's doing it. Adrian did not change overnight. Betrayal rarely announces itself with a single dramatic moment. It arrives in inches, disguised as reasonable doubt. The man who once drove 40 minutes out of his way to bring Elena her favorite flowers on ordinary Tuesdays began forgetting anniversaries altogether. The husband who used to reach for her hand under restaurant tables began finding reasons to work late. The father who once refused to travel anywhere without his son began missing bedtime stories, then missed weeks of them until Oliver stopped waiting up. Something inside their home had broken, quietly, the way most things do. The other side of the bed stayed empty more nights than not. His phone sat face down on the counter, screen turned away from her. A small habit that had never existed before. Dinner grew quieter each week, the silence stretching a little longer between them until it filled the space where conversation used to be. But even as the marriage cooled, something else lingered underneath it. A small, unplaceable unease that Adrian could never quite name. Some nights, watching Elena move through the house with their son, he would catch himself uncertain, just for a moment, of what exactly he was allowing himself to become. He never let the feeling win, but it never fully left him either. A detail that would matter more than he understood until the very end of this story. Elena noticed the small things first, the way anyone does before they let themselves see the larger shape hiding behind them. A hospital board meeting she wasn't invited to. A patent filing with unfamiliar names attached to her research. A phone call from an old colleague, hesitant and apologetic, asking whether it was true that the board had quietly begun referring to Adrian, and Adrian alone, as the hospital's sole director. She told herself there had to be an explanation. She told herself that for longer than she should have, because the alternative was too large to hold all at once. The truth, when it finally arrived all together, like a dam breaking rather than a slow leak. For months, Adrian and Victoria had been quietly rewriting who got credit for Elena's life's work. 10 years of laboratories at 2 a.m, of infants so small and fragile that most surgeons wouldn't attempt what she was attempting. Of failing the procedure more times than she ever admitted to anyone but her father, refining it millimeter by millimeter until it finally, reliably, worked. It was the reason strangers now brought their babies home instead of burying them. It was the one thing in the world Elena had built with nothing but her own hands and her own stubbornness. And it was the first thing Adrian and Victoria decided to take from her. It started with the patent filings, the legal documents that named who had actually invented the procedure. Adrian's name was quietly added, then moved until it sat above Elena's instead of beside it. Board minutes were altered the same way. Some entries changed, others invented outright, until the written record credited Adrian with breakthroughs that had never been his. No forged paper could change who Elena was. Everyone on that board had known her since she was a girl running through her father's hallways, and nothing Adrian or Victoria manufactured could erase that history. What they could do was make the board doubt whether Elena was still the right person to run the hospital day to day. That doubt was enough of an opening. For months, Victoria had been quietly weaving her father's wealth into the hospital's finances, and now that money did the rest. When she made it clear that further funding depended on new leadership, on someone the family trusted to modernize the institution, most of the board found it remarkably easy to agree. Elena was not erased from the hospital's history. She was simply outvoted, kept on in a ceremonial role built entirely around her father's name, while the actual decisions, the actual authority, went to Adrian. When Elena finally understood the full shape of it, she did not confront Adrian with rage. She confronted him with something quieter and far more devastating: the specific grief of loving someone whose face you no longer fully recognize. "I stood beside you when nobody knew your name," she told him, her voice low, steady, refusing to break even as everything inside her did. "I believed in you when you had nothing to offer the world but potential. I gave you my research, my name, my father's legacy, my trust. How could you do this to me?" Adrian did not look away from her, and that somehow made it worse. There was no shame in his expression, only a kind of cold, settled resolve, as if he had rehearsed his answer long before this conversation ever arrived. "Love is not enough, Elena," he said. "The world belongs to people who take what they deserve." In that single sentence, Elena understood something she would spend the next 3 years of her life trying to survive. The man standing in front of her was wearing her husband's face, but the person who had once loved her was already gone. What she did not yet understand, what she could not have imagined, even in her darkest private moments, was that Adrian and Victoria's ambitions had already moved past reputation and money. They wanted her gone, entirely, permanently, in a way that would leave no version of Elena Whitmore left to reclaim anything at all. The invitation sounded ordinary. That was the point. Adrian said they needed to talk about the hospital's future. Quietly, away from the board, away from lawyers, just the two of them and Victoria at a private coastal property the Ashfords had owned for years. Elena went, not because she trusted him, because some small, foolish part of her still hoped she could salvage something. A father for her son, a partner for the hospital, anything. She did not know she was walking toward the edge of her own life. The conversation turned cold within minutes. Then it turned threatening. A push, disguised for half a second as an accident. Victoria's expression made it clear it was nothing of the kind. 40 feet down, the ocean was waiting. That night, in a house that had once felt like home to her, Adrian and Victoria opened a bottle of champagne. They believed they had gotten away with everything. What neither of them noticed, in the haze of that celebration, was the small security camera mounted above the property's back terrace, installed years earlier by a previous owner and never removed, quietly recording everything said on that terrace long after the champagne was poured. What they didn't know, what no one plotting a death in the dark can ever account for, is that the universe sometimes sends someone anyway. That night, a woman named Lady Catherine Beaumont was out on that same black water, for reasons that had nothing to do with Elena at all. Lady Catherine Beaumont was not supposed to be anywhere near that stretch of coastline that night. She is an heiress, 60 years old, and one of the most influential women in her own country, a nation across the water from the life Elena had just lost. A woman whose family fortune, and the empire she'd built on top of it, gave her a level of power most people only read about. She rarely traveled that far from home, but she'd taken her private yacht out that evening while it was docked nearby, restless in the particular way that wealthy, solitary people sometimes are. All that money and influence had never replaced the one thing she actually wanted. Her own husband had betrayed her decades earlier, in a quieter, more ordinary way than what had just happened to Elena, but a betrayal all the same, and she had never remarried, and she had never been blessed with the child she had once wanted more than any fortune in the world. when her crew spotted something pale moving weakly against the black water. Not debris, not driftwood, but a hand. Lady Catherine didn't wait for a full rescue procedure. She grabbed the throw line herself, shouted for the boat to cut its engine, and leaned out over the rail as her crew brought the boat alongside. When the line reached the woman's hand and she was too weak to hold on, it was Lady Catherine who reached down into the water and pulled her the rest of the way up onto the deck, refusing to let go until two of her crew helped haul them both back over the rail. Elena's injuries were severe. That same night, Lady Catherine had her brought aboard and set sail immediately for home, away from the coastline where the world believed Elena had died, back across the water to a country where nobody had ever heard the name Elena Whitmore. Her face and scalp had taken the worst of the fall against the rocks below the cliff, and in the weeks that followed, in a private hospital far from any public record, surgeons worked to save not just her life, but whatever pieces of her body could still be salvaged. The reconstruction changed more than her injuries required: a new hairline, a subtly rebuilt jaw, a face that was recognizably Elena only to those who had loved her before all of this. Lady Catherine stayed beside her through every one of those weeks. She did not ask questions until Elena was ready to offer answers, and when Elena finally did, in a hushed hospital room, in the middle of the night, unable to hold the story inside her chest for one more hour, Lady Catherine listened without interruption. She listened as Elena described her father's hospital and the patent that had been stolen out from under her, and the small boy she had left behind. A boy who was, as far as anyone in the world knew, now a motherless child living in the same house as the woman who had helped orchestrate his mother's murder. "They tried to destroy your life," Lady Catherine said, taking Elena's still bandaged hand in both of hers. "But they forgot something important. A person's true identity was never in her face. It is in her purpose." In the weeks that followed, Lady Catherine legally adopted Elena as her own daughter, folding her quietly into a family with no living heirs and an empire in need of someone worthy to inherit it. With that adoption came a new name on every document that mattered: Dr. Elena Beaumont. Though Lady Catherine made sure the one name Elena kept was her first, the name a little boy might still recognize if he ever heard it spoken again. But the legal paperwork was, in truth, the smallest part of what she gave. What Lady Catherine actually offered Elena was time, the rarest gift there is. Time to grieve, time to rage, time to rebuild something out of the wreckage of everything that had been taken from her. The years that followed were not glamorous. There was no easy montage skimming past the difficulty of what rebuilding a life actually requires. There were mornings Elena could not get out of bed. There were nights she woke gasping, certain she could still feel the ocean closing over her head. There were entire seasons where the woman who had once been celebrated as one of the finest surgeons in the world could not bring herself to pick up a scalpel at all, terrified that her hands, too, had been broken beyond repair. Lady Catherine never rushed her. She simply stayed, the way a lighthouse stays, present and steady, asking nothing of the ships passing in the dark except that they find their own way home eventually. Slowly, in fragments, Elena returned to herself. She retrained. She relearned procedures her own hands had once invented, forcing her fingers to remember what trauma had tried to make them forget. With Lady Catherine's resources behind her, Elena opened a private medical center under a new name, in a country far from the one that had buried her. Within a few short years, she was once again spoken of in hushed, reverent tones among neonatal specialists worldwide, though almost nobody outside Lady Catherine's inner circle understood who she had once been. But no accolade, no international recognition, no rebuilt reputation ever came close to filling the specific, aching absence of her son. She watched him from a distance, the only way she safely could, through carefully arranged, entirely legal channels of information, through investigators Lady Catherine quietly employed, through photographs that arrived every few months showing a small boy growing taller, growing quieter, growing up without her. What she learned broke something in her all over again. Victoria, whenever Adrian was present, performed the role of loving stepmother with practiced precision. Soft voice, gentle hands, warm smiles for the cameras and the in-laws. But in the private hours, when no one else was watching, the mask came off, and what remained was cold, dismissive, occasionally cruel in the quiet ways that leave no visible mark, but hollow out a child from the inside. One report reached Elena that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. A household microphone installed for security purposes had captured Oliver's voice late one night, small and unsteady in the dark.
God, please protect my mommy in heaven. Dear God, please tell her I still love her.
The boy whispered into a room that believed itself empty. Please tell her I still love her. Elena listened to the recording once. She did not need to listen to it again. It had already carved itself permanently into her memory. Every instinct in her body told her to run, to cross whatever distance remained between herself and her son, and simply hold him. Consequences be damned. Lady Catherine was the one who kept her from doing exactly that. If you return too early, Lady Catherine told her gently, they will destroy you again. Return when justice cannot be stopped. So Elena waited. Not passively, never passively, but with the specific, disciplined patience of a woman who understood that the version of justice worth having could not be rushed. 3 years passed this way until Oliver was no longer the toddler she remembered, but a solemn 5-year-old who had learned to keep his grief quiet. The invitation, when it finally came, arrived exactly the way Lady Catherine had always said it would. Not sought, but earned. Elena's former hospital, the one her own father had built, was facing a case that had defeated every specialist they had consulted. A newborn with an exceptionally rare heart defect needed the very procedure Elena herself had pioneered years earlier. One almost no other surgeon in the world had ever successfully replicated. Doctors across 3 continents had already failed. So the hospital's leadership did what desperate people in medicine always do when their own doctors run out of answers. They started calling around, quietly, through international medical channels, asking who, anywhere in the world, could still perform it. The same name kept coming back to them. Dr. Elena Beaumont, of the Beaumont Specialist Neonatal Hospital, a private institution Lady Catherine had built from nothing and staffed with the finest neonatal team money could gather, specifically so that her daughter would have somewhere to become brilliant again, quietly, far from anyone who might recognize her. Nobody inside the Whitmore Children's Medical Center, not the board, not the administrators, not Adrian, who now ran the very institution her father had built as its sole director, understood that the surgeon they were begging to fly in from across the world was the same woman they had all once mourned as dead. The reconstructive surgery, the new name, and 3 years neither Adrian nor Victoria had spent looking closely at her face had done what neither of them could have planned for. They had made Elena a stranger to the 2 people who once knew her best. Elena accepted the invitation without hesitation, though her hands trembled as she signed the paperwork. Walking back through those doors for the first time in years, she felt the specific vertigo of standing inside a memory made physical. The same tile floors her father had chosen decades earlier, the same hush that settled over every hallway near the neonatal wing. The infant at the center of it all was a girl not yet 3 days old, born to a young couple named the Alvarezes. Twice already, other doctors had told them there was nothing more medicine could do for her. Every specialist the hospital had flown in said the same thing in different words. The surgery required was too dangerous to attempt, the risk too high to justify trying. In their grief and fear, the Alvarezes had begun preparing a lawsuit, refusing to believe that no one, anywhere, could save their daughter. The hospital's board, already anxious about its reputation, saw Elena's arrival as a last chance to save both a child's life and their own legal exposure in the same breath. Elena reviewed the girl's scans for nearly 6 hours before she spoke a single word to the surgical team. When she finally did, she asked for a procedure to be assembled that had never once been attempted in that hospital's history. A variation of her own original technique, adapted in real time for a defect she had only ever seen described in medical journals from the other side of the world. The surgery took 11 hours. At the 90-second mark, the infant's heart stopped entirely. No one moved, no one spoke. The alarms were the only sound in the room. Then, impossibly, the small heart began beating again on its own. Elena stepped back from the table. She did not smile. She did not speak. She nodded once, and the surgical team around her began to breathe again, some of them crying openly beneath their masks. The Alvarezes were allowed in to see their daughter 2 hours later. Her father dropped to his knees beside the incubator, unable to speak. Her mother pressed both hands against the glass and wept the particular, disbelieving tears of a parent who had already begun grieving a child who was, against every prediction, still alive. Within the week, the family withdrew their lawsuit entirely. In its place, they wrote a public letter of gratitude, one the hospital would go on to frame in its own lobby. Medical journals picked the story up first, then international news outlets, each repeating some version of the same astonished headline. A surgery once considered impossible, performed successfully by a surgeon almost no one outside a small circle had ever heard of. Referrals poured in from countries that had never sent a patient there before. Almost overnight, Whitmore Children's Medical Center, respected but regional until that week, found itself mentioned in the same breath as the great teaching hospitals of the world. Adrian, the hospital's director, gave interview after interview, taking credit for having recruited the surgeon, whose skill had just transformed his hospital's reputation overnight. He never once imagined how close that surgeon's real name had once been to his own. It was Margaret Hayes, an elderly surgical nurse who had worked at Elena's side and her father's side for nearly 40 years, who first felt something she could not name. She watched the new surgeon move through pre-operative preparation with an economy of motion, a specific way of holding instruments, a particular gentleness in the way she spoke to infants too small to understand words, but never too small to feel tone. Margaret had trained enough surgeons across 4 decades to know that skill could be taught, but the specific quality of how this woman worked, that could not. "I don't know who you are," Margaret told her quietly one evening, after the ward had gone silent and most of the staff had gone home. "But you remind me of someone I loved very much." Elena kept her expression carefully still. "Who was she?" Margaret's eyes, when she answered, were wet with an old grief that had never fully healed. Dr. Elena Whitmore. Elena said nothing. She let the silence stretch between them, heavy with everything she could not yet say. And Margaret, sensing something she did not fully understand, but instinctively trusted, did not push further. That night, Elena slipped past the gate and stood outside her son's window. Inside, he sat cross-legged on the floor, his storybook open and forgotten in his lap, the teddy bear held close against his chest. He wasn't reading anymore. He was talking, softly, the way children do when they think no one can hear. I really missed my mama, who is now in the sky. I wish I could remember her face, he said, tilting his head back to look up at the ceiling as though it were the sky itself. Elena pressed her hand against the glass. Watching him search a ceiling for a face he couldn't find went through her like something breaking. She was standing 3 feet away from him, alive, breathing, close enough to see the small crease of worry between his eyebrows. And to him, she no longer existed at all. She wanted to knock, to press her palm flat against the window until he looked down instead of up, until he saw that the face he was searching the sky for was right here. Instead, she stood there and let the tears come silently, one hand still on the glass, until she couldn't trust herself to stay a moment longer. She stepped back into the dark, and the window went on, holding nothing but a boy and his teddy bear, and a mother he thought was gone. In the weeks that followed, Elena began, deliberately and quietly, laying the groundwork for what was coming. She walked the same halls where she had once trained as a resident. She stood, for the first time in years, inside the office that had once been hers. She said little, revealed nothing directly, but something about her presence unsettled the hospital's current leadership in a way neither Adrian nor Victoria could quite articulate. Victoria, in particular, grew increasingly uneasy. She could not say why the new surgeon's voice occasionally made the back of her neck prickle, or why certain gestures, a specific way of tilting her head while listening, a particular manner of folding her hands before delivering difficult news to a frightened family, felt uncomfortably, impossibly familiar. Adrian felt it too, though he would not have admitted it to anyone, perhaps not even to himself. It was there in the small, unplaceable unease that had followed him for 3 years, the same feeling he'd never let himself name back when Elena was still his wife. Watching Dr. Beaumont from across a conference room, he sometimes found himself staring a beat too long, and then looking away before he had to ask himself why. Then came the twist that neither Adrian nor Victoria could have prepared for, no matter how carefully they had constructed the life they now lived inside. The affair between Victoria and Adrian, which had begun quietly in the months before the cliffside, had never fully ended. And now, 3 years later, Victoria was pregnant. Routine prenatal screening revealed what no one in that hospital wanted to hear. The child growing inside her had the same exceptionally rare condition that had brought Elena back through those doors in the first place. A condition that, left alone, would very likely kill the baby before or shortly after birth. There was only one way to save it, and it wasn't a surgery that could wait for the child to be born. It had to be done now, while the baby was still inside the womb. A fetal surgery, one of the most delicate and dangerous procedures in all of medicine, requiring a surgeon skilled enough to operate on a patient smaller than a human hand, without harming the mother carrying it. There was only one surgeon in the entire region who had ever successfully performed it. The woman Adrian and Victoria had pushed off a cliff 3 years earlier was now the only person who could save the unborn child growing inside the woman who had tried to kill her. When hospital administration approached Elena to request that she personally perform the surgery, she did not hesitate, and she did not reveal, in that moment, the full weight of what she was agreeing to do. She would save the life of the child still growing inside the body of the woman who had tried to end hers. Not out of forgiveness, not out of forgetting, but because somewhere in the long years of rebuilding herself, Elena had made a decision that would come to define the rest of her story far more than any act of revenge ever could. That she would not become the kind of person capable of what had been done to her. The surgery, when it finally happened, was the most delicate of Elena's career. She operated through a small incision in Victoria's abdomen and into the womb itself, working on a patient not yet born, barely larger than the palm of her own hand, while a full surgical team monitored both mother and unborn child for any sign that either life was slipping away. Hours passed in near silence. When Elena finally stepped back from the table and the fetal monitor confirmed a strong, steady heartbeat, the room around her erupted into the particular controlled joy of medical staff who have just watched an almost impossible thing succeed. The baby was born healthy months later, while Victoria was still a free woman, with no idea that the surgeon who had just saved her daughter's life was about to become the reason she lost her freedom entirely. The media, once they caught wind of the story, could not resist it. An anonymous, reclusive surgeon, summoned from across the world, performing a surgery on an unborn child that no one else in the region had ever dared attempt. Elena's name, Dr. Beaumont's name, became known internationally within days. Journalists sought interviews. Hospitals across the globe requested consultations. "I have a story to tell," she told the assembled press, her voice calm, unhurried, carrying the weight of someone who has waited a very long time to say something and refuses to be rushed now that the moment has finally arrived. A story about betrayal, about survival, and about justice. The hospital, thrilled by the global attention and the impossible surgical success, organized a major press conference to celebrate what they believed was simply an extraordinary medical achievement. Adrian and Victoria sat in the front row, dressed for celebration, believing without a shred of doubt that they were there to bask in reflected glory. The miracle surgeon who had saved their child, and by extension, saved the hospital's reputation and their own. They had no understanding, none at all, of what was about to unfold in front of a room full of cameras. Elena walked onto that stage the way she once walked into operating rooms, steady, composed, entirely present. She let her eyes move across the room. Then she spoke. "My name," she said, "is Elena Whitmore." Silence. Total silence. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. A glass slipped from Adrian's hand and shattered against the floor. Victoria's face drained of all color. Her mouth opened. No sound came out. What followed was not rage. It was worse than rage, because it was precise, documented, and undeniable. Elena laid it out, piece by piece, in front of cameras that would broadcast every word within the hour. The stolen patent, the forged research, the falsified hospital records, the financial fraud built on her life's work, the attempted murder on a cliffside 3 years earlier, and the quiet, sustained mistreatment of a small boy who had spent 3 years believing his mother was gone forever. Lady Catherine's investigators, present at the conference exactly as planned, released the full body of evidence to the press in real time. Financial records, forensic analysis, documented testimony, and security footage recovered from the coastal property's own overlooked terrace camera, which corroborated every claim. There was no room left for denial, no angle left for spin. Richard Ashford tried, as he always had, to make the problem disappear with money and lawyers. It was the first time in his life that approach failed him completely. A federal judge, a woman with a well-earned reputation for refusing to be influenced by wealth or status, took personal interest in the case once the evidence became public, and the sheer weight of what had been uncovered left no legal room for maneuvering. Adrian and Victoria were arrested within days, though it would take far longer than a single news cycle for the full weight of the law to close around them. 2 months later, a federal grand jury returned formal indictments against both of them: attempted murder, conspiracy to commit murder, large-scale financial fraud, forgery of medical and corporate records, and obstruction of justice. Each line of the indictment was built from evidence Lady Catherine's investigators had spent 3 years quietly assembling. Falsified patent filings cross-referenced against the real dates of Elena's original research, financial transfers that traced Adrian's independent funding directly back to fabricated shell accounts, and forensic analysis, placing both of them at the scene the night Elena went into the water. Richard Ashford spent a fortune on the best defense attorneys money could buy. It bought his daughter nothing but a longer, more humiliating trial. The prosecution's case was airtight in a way defense attorneys rarely encounter. Time-stamped, corroborated, undeniable. Adrian's own signature appeared on forged documents. Victoria's voice appeared on the terrace security recording taken the very night of the fall, admitting, in an unguarded moment just after the champagne was poured, that she had made sure Elena wouldn't be a problem again. The trial lasted 6 weeks. Elena did not attend every session. Lady Catherine had told her, gently but firmly, that she did not owe the courtroom her presence, only her testimony. But she was there on the final day, seated near the back, quiet. The jury returned its verdict after less than 4 hours, guilty, on every count. Sentencing came before Judge Alicia Reyes, 20 years on the federal bench and a reputation for being moved by neither wealth nor pressure. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The room was silent enough that every word reached its farthest corner. "This court has seen fraud before," Judge Reyes said, looking not at the attorneys, but directly at the 2 people seated at the defense table. "It has seen greed, and it has seen betrayal. What makes this case different is not the scale of what was stolen. It is the deliberate, calculated attempt to end a human life in order to steal it, and the 3 years that followed, in which a child was left to believe his mother was dead, while the people responsible raised him under their own roof." She let that settle before she continued. "The law cannot give Dr. Elena Whitmore back the years she lost. It cannot give her son back the childhood he spent grieving a mother who was, in fact, still alive. What this court can do is ensure that neither of you is given the opportunity to do this to anyone else again." Adrian Cross was sentenced to 32 years without possibility of parole. Victoria Ashford received 28, the difference reflecting Adrian's role in falsifying the medical and financial records that had built their cover. Richard Ashford's attorneys filed an appeal within the hour. It would go nowhere. The evidence had left no crack wide enough to work through. With both parents facing decades in prison, the court granted full custody of Victoria's daughter to Richard Ashford, who took the girl into his own home to raise her. An old man now left, for the first time in his life, to answer for something money alone couldn't fix. Outside, the November air had turned sharp and metallic. The kind of cold that arrives early in the season and catches everyone slightly unprepared. A thin, colorless sky hung low over the courthouse steps, and a light wind scattered the last of the fallen leaves across the stone in uneven, restless circles. Elena stepped out through the tall courthouse doors into that cold, and for a moment she simply stood there, letting it settle against her skin. The specific, grounding sensation of weather, of being alive to feel it, of standing on solid ground instead of falling through black water. Cameras waited at a respectful distance, held back by the security Lady Catherine had arranged, and for the first time in 3 years, Elena did not feel the need to hide from a single one of them. Then she saw him. Oliver stood near the base of the steps, bundled against the cold in a coat that was already a size too small for how much he'd grown. One gloved hand held tightly in Lady Catherine's. He was taller than the photographs had prepared her for. Taller and older around the eyes in a way that no child should have to be. But the moment he saw her, something in his face broke open with a recognition that no number of years or absences could erase. He did not wait for permission. He pulled his hand free of Lady Catherine's and ran. Elena went down the remaining steps to meet him, her composure carefully held through 6 weeks of testimony, through a lifetime of loss, finally giving way all at once. She dropped to her knees on the cold stone without a thought for the cameras, without a thought for anything except the small, solid weight of her son colliding into her arms. Oliver did not say anything at first. He simply held on to her, his face pressed into her shoulder, his whole body shaking with the particular wordless sobbing of a child who has spent years being told, gently by well-meaning adults, that some sadness has to be carried quietly. He did not have to carry it quietly anymore. "I told him you'd come back," Lady Catherine said softly, coming to stand beside them, her own eyes bright with tears she made no effort to hide. "I told him every single day that his mother was the strongest person I had ever known." Elena looked up at her from where she knelt on the courthouse steps, still holding Oliver as though letting go might undo everything the last 3 years had rebuilt, and reached one arm out. Lady Catherine stepped into it without hesitation, and for a long moment the three of them stood together in the cold November air. The daughter the ocean had failed to keep, the woman who had pulled her out of it, and the boy who had never once stopped believing his mother would find her way home. While the cameras, for once, simply let them have the moment. Justice, when it finally arrived, did not arrive as vengeance. It arrived as consequence, cold, thorough, and entirely earned. But it was this moment, not the sentencing, that marked the story's true ending. A mother on her knees on courthouse stone. A son who no longer had to whisper his prayers into an empty room. And a family built from loss that had, against every possible odds, found its way back to itself. Elena regained legal control of the Whitmore Children's Medical Center, the institution her father had spent 40 years building. She could have used that reclaimed power in any number of ways. She chose, instead, something that surprised even the people who thought they understood her by then. She transformed the hospital into a non-profit medical institution, ensuring that children would receive life-saving treatment regardless of their family's ability to pay. it was not an act of forgiveness toward the people who had wronged her. Elena never once claimed to have forgiven Adrian or Victoria, and none of what she did afterward asked that of her. It was, instead, a decision about what kind of legacy she wanted her survival to build. She had been given back her life through no small miracle, and she chose to spend that second chance making sure other families would not have to fight as hard as she once had to save the children they loved. She continued to oversee Lady Catherine's global medical empire, expanding its reach into regions that had never before had access to advanced neonatal care. And most importantly, she reclaimed the relationship that had been stolen from her for 3 long years. Her son. Oliver, older now, quieter than he might have been in a life without this particular grief, came to understand slowly, gently, with the careful help of therapists and Lady Catherine's patient guidance, that the mother he believed he had lost forever had in fact spent every single day of those 3 years finding her way back to him. Years later, at a celebration for Lady Catherine's 65th birthday, surrounded by the family she had built from nothing but generosity and time, Elena stood to give a short, unrehearsed speech. Oliver, now 10 years old, stood quietly at her side, no longer the little boy who had once whispered prayers into an empty room, but much older and who had grown up knowing, without a single doubt, exactly how loved he was. In the cold of that night, inside that black water, I thought it was my end, Elena said, her voice steady in a way it had not always been. I didn't know that God had a good plan for me, that Mummy Catherine would be the one to show up. When I lost everything, I thought my life was over. But someone was sent into my life who showed me something I didn't understand yet, that sometimes losing everything is only the beginning of finding out who you really are. She turned and embraced Lady Catherine, holding on the way people hold on to the ones who saved them, and Oliver reached for his mother's hand the way he had as a small child, as though no time at all had passed between them. She did not end her days standing over the wreckage of the people who wronged her, savoring a victory built on their downfall. Instead, months later, she stood back in an operating room, gloved hands steady over a newborn too small to understand the miracle being performed on her behalf, listening for the sound that had guided Elena's entire life since she was a girl sneaking into her father's hospital after school. A baby's first cry. It was after everything: the fall, the water, the years of rebuilding, the reckoning, the sound that reminded her exactly who she had always been, not a victim, the person who gives others their second chance at life. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that survival can be its own kind of justice, take a moment to subscribe, leave this video a like, and share it with someone who still believes that kindness, courage, and truth always find their way home. Thank you for watching until the very end. I'll see you in the next story.